All I would say is to Timothee Chalamet that if you want to come to the Royal Opera House, I will pay for you and Maddie to go together. Our next question comes from an anonymous listener who asks, Timothee Chalamet said in an interview that no one cares about ballet or opera. Could you please point out to him where he is so obviously wrong?
Okay, so Timothee Chalamet, I didn't know much about his personal life, but I looked him up after he said these things. He actually comes from a very musical family. I think his mother and sister are both trained ballet dancers, and he grew up in circles in New York that are basically heavily involved in ballet and high culture and opera. So that was an interesting thing for me because I didn't read his remarks so much as saying no one gives a damn. I know he said no one gives a damn, but I actually think what he was saying was we need to make a case for cinema as a medium because we don't want it to become a fringe, or maybe that's the wrong thing to say, but something that is purely highbrow pursuit that is not a kind of universal medium. I think that's what he was trying to say, but he didn't phrase it very well, and it sparked this predictable backlash. I think Timothee Chalamet is wrong that clearly a lot of people care very deeply about opera and ballet. I know you do, and many others, the amount of time and energy that people spend attending. But I can't help also noticing that although in many cases the opportunities to go and see ballet and opera are heavily subsidised, if you go in London, if you go to the Royal Opera House, if you're willing to sit in a not fantastic seat, you can go for £15 or £25. So it's cheaper in many cases than mass pursuits like a sports match, for example. I would love it to be more universal than it is. I suspect it is still a fairly highbrow and fairly, sadly, middle-class pursuit. So I think Timothee Chalamet was actually trying to make a more profound point than he realised. And there are some now even saying that his rather poorly thought-through remarks could actually cost him the Oscar, for which he's nominated at one of the Oscars very soon.
Yes, for Marty Supreme, in which he plays a...
Yes, but I would also, just one more point, I suspect that ultimately he will be proved wrong by the fact that people will still be listening to Verdi and Puccini and Wagner in hundreds of years. I'm not sure if people will still be watching Marty Supreme, if we even have a universe in 300 years.
Are you an opera lover or a ballet lover? And if so, what's the attraction for you?
Oh, I love them both. I was very lucky. My parents had me when they were both quite, I guess, comparatively old for parents. My dad was in his 50s, my mum in her late 30s. And they... I've been really fortunate that because of having kids late, I think they felt that they shouldn't sort of completely change their life because they had kids. So rather than be taken to classic kid things, we were often given an amazing experience of going to see things at quite a young age. We would travel down. I mean, it's something my dad, I almost never saw him cry in my life, but he gets very emotional watching a ballet, for example. So I've been really fortunate. I'm not a musical person, so I think we've talked about this before, but I cannot explain to you what is so great in technical terms about the music or the quality of the dancing, but I know that it sparks something very deep and a sense of awe and wonder when I see and hear it.
Did you, when you were younger, have either ballet or singing lessons?
No, I was quite disobedient. I remembered being taken to some kind of dance lesson, but I think being chucked out for being naughty and not very naturally musical. So again, I think there may have been attempts to get us to do it, but we were not natural musicians, that's for sure.
If someone said, it's all very well, the ballet, but I can listen to delightful music on Spotify in the comfort of my bath. Why do I have to go to the theatre to see people prancing around? What is it about the physical movement in ballet that may or may not be entrancing?
Well, it's the experience, isn't it? It's obviously you can enjoy watching a football match on TV, but nothing quite compares to the experience of seeing it in the crowd, the reactions of your fellow listeners, the superior acoustics, and being so close. I mean, I go quite often. I don't usually fork out for a particularly good seat. But sometimes if you're lucky and you're going last minute, you can get something that's actually quite near, in quite a decent position without forking over hundreds and hundreds of pounds for it. And I've had that experience. And when you're so close that you can actually see the muscle straining and the dedication and commitment that went into that training. It's a pretty special experience.
The notion of having to be there in order to fully experience it was something that was very, very pronounced in Wagner's own idea of opera. So he built his own opera house, or got the King of Bavaria to build it for him in Bayreuth in the northern part of Bavaria. And what he believed in was something he called the total artwork.
Gesamtkunstwerk. Yes. Gesamtkunstwerk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the idea then was that it would be a sort of quasi-religious experience. And so when you go to Bayreuth, it is explicitly like being in a church. So you sit on these wooden seats, which are not supposed to be particularly comfortable. You're not supposed to relax. You're supposed to pay attention. Then all the doors close. You're in darkness before the first chord of the orchestra is struck for the overture of the Vorspiel and so on. So all of it's designed to shut out the rest of the world and to mean that there is total immersion in the art. Now, I know that for many people that will sound pretentious, but the whole point is that it's meant to be and is an experience like no other. Many of us will either listen to background music of whatever kind while we're driving, working, chilling in the bath, or whatever it might be. But there is something, both about opera and ballet, when it's fully absorbed and your attention is fully absorbed by it, that is special. Now, that wasn't always the case. It would have been the case that in the past with opera and with ballet, you would have had, just as you had with drama in the 16th, 17th and 18th century, you would have had people flirting, gossiping, tucking in their food and wine.
The high-end seats and the cheap seats.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All sorts of fossicking and flirting going on at the same time as the drama. And the drama or the ballet or the opera would have been an additional entertainment. And, to my mind, there's nothing sinful about working your way through some Fox's Glacier mints while you are listening to something delightful. But I think the point about ballet and opera is that it's the fusion of the voice, the performance, the presence, the crowd, and the greatest opera is designed to take you out of the temporal and the daily and to connect you with something more powerful, not necessarily transcendent.
Yes.
Exactly.
Jinx. Is it then the case that, because you're talking about the way that opera used to be performed, say, in the 18th century, you will know better than me if this is historically accurate, but in the film Amadeus, one of my favourite films, it's clear that Mozart's operas are not always being performed to a high-end audience, or rather they may start out that way, but gradually they become more of a kind of a universal everyman's entertainment. You can see this in the way that they stage it. Now, I don't know if the film is accurate or not. I know it surely takes many, many liberties. But is it not the case that opera today does not have that kind of mass audience that it once did?
No, that's true.
Also thinking, I know that probably any true music lovers listening to this will give me a hard time, but I love Gilbert Sullivan. Arthur Sullivan, I think, is a truly great composer who enjoyed success at the time, not just with Gilbert and Sullivan, but with other endeavours too. Wrote some very popular songs. He felt a great sense of failure because he always dreamed of having a kind of high-end opera being staged. There is something pretty special about what is going on at that time in English music, where it's kind of, Gilbert and Sullivan seems to be enjoyed by people at all different strata of society. I wonder if we could say the same thing about opera today.
I think there is that problem that opera has become, as has often been noted, associated with exclusivity. So it's a prestige art form. It was a prestige art form that, as Amadeus brings out, was indulged by or was supported by courts. As we mentioned earlier, Wagner was only able to build his special purpose-built theatre, which is only used 1 month a year because of the generosity of the King of Bavaria. So it's on one level, its origins not as a democratic art form. On the other hand, though, it should be accessible to everyone. But to put on an opera production, to get the cast, to get the chorus, to get the orchestra, is not cheap.
No.
In comparison to
excellence is never going to be cheap. And if you cut corners, you don't get the experience that you're talking about.
Yeah. But to be fair to the Royal Opera House and the poor old English National Opera and others, there have been consistent efforts to try to make sure that access to opera and to ballet can be democratized. And also, if you look at the efforts of people like Sadler's Wells, they
Yeah.
do ensure that ballet and dance are accessible more broadly. And there are efforts to bring opera into schools elsewhere. But one of the things I'd love to know from listeners is whether or not they think that the barriers around opera and ballet are still too high, or some people might think they're poncely elitist, or listeners might well want to draw attention to any of the historical or other errors that we've inevitably made in our what is inevitably a very personal survey. And I remember a friend of mine with whom I used to work on newspapers in Scotland, whose father was a railway engineer, and who his father knew more about opera than almost anyone I've ever known. But I also remember being told by my former wife, Sarah, that at the back of La Scala, Milan, the great opera house in the north of Italy, you would have truck drivers who would be mouthing along with the words to Verdi and Puccini because they knew them by heart. So it is the case that there are people from every background,
Yes.
but the image of exclusivity remains. All I would say is to Timothée Chalamet that if you want to come to the Royal Opera House, I will pay for you and Maddie to go together on condition that you write about the experience afterwards for The Spectator.